There are some mirrors you should never look into after the sun goes down, especially the ones in antique shops along the Maine coast. Rayna Potter learned this the hard way when she ignored an old dealer's warning and stayed past sunset. What she saw in that Victorian mirror wasn't just her reflection staring back. It was something that had been waiting in the glass for decades, something that wanted her body more than she could ever imagine. And by the time Rayna realised what was happening, the thing wearing her face had already won. Rayna Potter had driven 3 hours up the Maine coast looking for authentic Victorian furniture when she found the shop tucked between 2 abandoned warehouses. The sign above the door read Holloway's Antiquities in faded gold lettering, and through the salt-stained windows she could see the kind of pristine 19th century pieces that made her heart race. She was a psychology professor with a weakness for history, and this place looked like it had been frozen in time. The bell above the door chimed as she stepped inside, and immediately she knew this wasn't like other antique shops. The air felt heavy, almost thick, and every surface gleamed with obsessive care. Mahogany dressers lined the walls, crystal chandeliers caught the afternoon light, and everywhere, absolutely everywhere, mirrors hung draped in white cloth, their frames peeking out like ghosts waiting to be unveiled. An elderly man emerged from the back room, moving with the careful precision of someone who'd learned to navigate his space in the dark. His name was Mr. Holloway, and his eyes were the palest blue Rayna had ever seen, almost colourless. He greeted her politely enough, but his gaze immediately flicked to the windows where the autumn sun was already sinking toward the horizon. Rayna asked about a writing desk near the window, but Mr. Holloway barely seemed to hear her. Instead, he glanced at his watch, then back at the fading light, and told her with unexpected urgency that the shop would be closing soon. Very soon. Within the hour, in fact. She found that strange. It was barely 4:30 in the afternoon. Rayna moved deeper into the shop, running her fingers along the edge of a carved mirror frame hidden beneath its cloth covering. She asked him why all the mirrors were draped like this, whether it was to protect them from dust or sunlight. It seemed excessive for someone running a business. Mr. Holloway's response came too quickly, his voice tight with something that sounded almost like fear. He told her the mirrors stayed covered for safety, that they weren't for sale, that she shouldn't touch them. Rayna pulled her hand back, startled by his tone. She'd dealt with eccentric collectors before, but this felt different. The old man's hands were trembling now, his fingers curling and uncurling at his sides, like he was fighting the urge to physically push her toward the door. She tried to lighten the mood, laughing softly, as she asked if he thought the mirrors were cursed or something. It was meant as a joke. Mr. Holloway didn't laugh. Instead, he stepped closer, close enough that Rayna could see the deep lines carved into his face, the way his jaw worked as if he were chewing on words he didn't want to say. Then he told her something that made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. He said that if she was going to stay in his shop, there was one rule she absolutely had to follow. Never. And he emphasised this word with a gravity that felt almost religious. Never look into the mirrors after dark. Rayna blinked, unsure whether she'd heard him correctly. She asked him what he meant by that, why it would matter what time of day it was. Mr. Holloway's pale eyes darted to the nearest covered mirror, then back to her face. He told her there were things that lived in the glass, things that waited, things that watched. And when the sun went down and the barrier between their world and ours grew thin, those things could reach through. But only if you looked, only if you made eye contact. The rational part of Rayna's brain, the part that had spent years studying cognitive biases and the psychology of belief, wanted to dismiss this as the ramblings of a lonely old man who'd spent too much time surrounded by antiques and ghost stories. But something about the way he spoke, the genuine terror in his voice, made her pause. She asked him if he'd ever seen something in the mirrors himself. Mr. Holloway's face went absolutely white. For a moment, he looked like he might answer, like he might finally tell her what had put that haunted look in his eyes. But then he simply turned away and told her again that the shop was closing. Now. She needed to leave. Rayna felt a flicker of frustration. She'd driven all this way, and she'd barely had a chance to look around. She told him she was genuinely interested in purchasing something, that she just needed a bit more time to browse the collection. Surely he could give her another hour. But Mr. Holloway was already moving toward the door, his movements jerky and desperate. He told her she could come back tomorrow, first thing in the morning. He'd give her a discount even. but she had to leave before sunset. Please. That word, please, carried so much weight it almost made Rayna reconsider. Almost. Instead, she made a decision that would cost her everything. She told Mr. Holloway that she was a serious buyer with serious money, and if he wanted her business, she needed time to properly examine the pieces. She asked if she could stay late, just for an hour or two after closing. She promised she wouldn't touch anything he didn't want her to touch. The old man's face crumpled. He looked at her with something that might have been pity, or grief, or both. He told her it was a mistake, that she didn't understand what she was asking for. But Rayna was already pulling out her wallet, already offering him double his asking. Price for the writing desk if he'd just let her stay and browse in peace. She was a rational woman, a scientist. She didn't believe in things that lived in mirrors or barriers between worlds. She believed in facts, in evidence, in the material reality of antique furniture and the psychology of superstition. Mr. Holloway stared at her for a long moment, his trembling hands now clenched into fists at his sides. Then, slowly, he nodded. He told her she could stay, but he made her promise, swear actually, with a fervour that felt almost religious, that she wouldn't uncover any of the mirrors, that she'd leave them draped, that she'd be gone before full dark. Rayna agreed easily, relieved to have won the argument. She barely noticed the way Mr. Holloway's shoulders sagged in defeat as he handed her the key and shuffled toward the door. She barely registered the way he paused on the threshold, looking back at her one last time with those pale, haunted eyes. He told her one more thing before he left. He said that 40 years ago, he'd made the same choice she was making now, and he'd been paying for it every day since. Then he was gone, the bell chiming softly as the door closed behind him, and Rayna was alone in the shop, with the covered mirrors and the dying light. She stood there for a moment, listening to the silence, feeling the weight of the old man's warning settle over her like a heavy blanket. Then she shook her head, laughed at her own nervousness, and turned back to the writing desk. She was a psychology professor. She understood how fear worked, how superstition took root in the human mind. Mr. Holloway was clearly suffering from some kind of paranoid delusion, probably brought on by isolation, and too many years spent alone with his antiques. There was nothing in the mirrors. There was nothing waiting in the glass. Rayna was absolutely certain of that. What Rayna didn't know was that Mr. Holloway had made the same mistake 40 years ago, and he'd been trying to warn people ever since. The first hour passed quietly enough. Rayna moved through the shop with her phone's flashlight, cataloguing pieces and taking notes. The writing desk was genuine Eastlake period, worth at least $3,000. A set of dining chairs near the back showed the distinctive characteristics of American Empire style. She was so absorbed in her work that she barely noticed the sun sinking lower, the shadows in the shop growing longer and stranger. By the time she looked up, the windows were bleeding orange and red, the last rays of sunset turning everything in the shop into a study of fire and darkness. The covered mirrors looked different now, their white cloths almost luminous in the dying light, like shrouded bodies standing at attention along the walls. Rayna felt a chill run down her spine and immediately scolded herself for it. She was letting Mr. Holloway's paranoia get to her, letting his superstitious warnings plant seeds of irrational fear in her mind. This was exactly the kind of cognitive contamination she taught her students to recognize and resist. She decided to leave soon. She'd seen enough for one day, and the shop was starting to feel oppressive in the gathering darkness. But as she turned toward the door, her eyes caught on something she'd somehow missed during her initial walkthrough. At the very back of the shop, partially hidden behind a Chinese screen, stood the largest mirror she'd ever seen outside of a museum. Even draped in its white cloth, she could see the ornate gold frame beneath, could make out the intricate carvings of roses and thorns that wound around its edges. The frame alone had to be worth a fortune. Rayna knew she should leave it covered. She'd promised Mr. Holloway. But her curiosity was a living thing now, burning in her chest. She was a collector, an academic, someone who appreciated craftsmanship and history. What harm could it do to just take a quick look? She approached the mirror slowly, her footsteps echoing on the wooden floor. The cloth was secured with pins, and her fingers fumbled with them in the dim light. She told herself she'd only peek for a moment, just long enough to assess its condition and potential value. Then she'd cover it back up and leave before full dark, just as she'd promised. The last pin came free, and the cloth slipped away like water. The mirror was breathtaking. The glass was pristine despite its obvious age, the surface so perfectly clear it seemed to have no depth at all. The gold frame was even more elaborate than she'd imagined, with dozens of carved roses blooming among thorny vines, their petals so delicate they looked like they might fall at any moment. But it was her reflection that held her attention. At first, everything looked normal. Rayna saw herself standing in the dimming shop, her dark hair slightly mussed from the long day, her expression curious and a little guilty. Behind her she could see the Chinese screen, the covered mirrors along the walls, the writing desk she'd been examining earlier. Then she blinked, and her reflection blinked a half-second later. Rayna froze, her heart suddenly hammering in her chest. She blinked again, deliberately this time, watching carefully. Her reflection's eyes closed and opened in perfect synchronization with her own. She exhaled slowly, feeling foolish. It had been a trick of the light, or her tired eyes playing games. She'd been up since 5 that morning, had driven 3 hours, had spent the last hour straining to see in increasingly poor lighting. Of course her perception was off. She smiled at her own nervousness, shaking her head at how easily Mr. Holloway's warnings had gotten under her skin. But in the mirror, her reflection's smile lingered a fraction too long. Even after Rayna's expression had faded back to neutral, the woman in the glass kept smiling, her lips curved in a way that didn't quite match Rayna's memory of her own face. Rayna's breath caught. She took a step back, and her reflection moved with her, but there was something wrong with the timing, something infinitesimally off about the synchronization. It was like watching a video with the audio slightly delayed, that uncanny wrongness that your brain recognized even when you couldn't quite articulate what was different. She forced herself to look away from her own face, to focus on the background of the reflection instead. The Chinese screen was there, yes, and the covered mirrors. But the writing desk, the one she'd been examining, the one that should have been directly behind her and to the left, was in a different position. In the mirror, it stood several feet to the right, and the chair beside it was facing the wrong direction. Rayna's mind raced, trying to find a rational explanation. Maybe there were 2 desks. Maybe she was misremembering the layout. Maybe the mirror's angle was creating some kind of optical distortion. But even as she thought these things, she knew they weren't true. She'd spent the last hour in this shop. She knew exactly where everything was. And the room in the mirror wasn't quite the same as the room she was standing in. Her reflection tilted its head, and Rayna realised with a jolt of pure terror that she hadn't moved at all. She stumbled backward, her hand flying to her mouth. This wasn't possible. Reflections didn't move on their own. They didn't tilt their heads or hold smiles too long, or exist in rooms where furniture had been rearranged. This was a hallucination. Had to be some kind of stress-induced break from reality. Rayna was a psychology professor. She knew about psychotic episodes, about how the brain could malfunction under extreme stress. She'd been working too hard lately, sleeping too little. Her department chair had warned her about burnout just last week. This was clearly some kind of dissociative event, a temporary glitch in her perception that would resolve itself once she got some rest. She laughed, and the sound came out high and nervous, echoing strangely in the empty shop. She told herself out loud that she was being ridiculous, that she was letting an old man's ghost stories mess with her head. She was exhausted, she was stressed. She needed to go home, get some sleep, and stop looking at mirrors in creepy antique shops after sunset. She turned away from the mirror, deliberately, forcing herself to move with calm, measured steps toward the door. She would not run, she would not panic. She was a rational adult who understood the difference between reality and imagination. But as she reached for her bag on the counter near the entrance, something made her glance back. The mirror stood at the far end of the shop, partially hidden behind the Chinese screen. And in its depths, her reflection was still there, still visible despite the angle being all wrong for that to be possible. And her reflection wasn't looking away. Rayna had turned her head. She was facing the door now, her body angled away from the mirror entirely. But the woman in the glass was staring directly forward, her eyes locked on something Rayna couldn't see, her expression intent and hungry, in a way that made Rayna's blood run cold. For a moment, just a heartbeat, just a fraction of a second, Rayna could have sworn the reflection's lips moved. Not in speech, but in something that looked almost like a smile of triumph. Then Rayna was moving, her rational mind finally surrendering to the primal fear screaming through her nervous system. She grabbed her bag, fumbled with the door lock, and burst out into the parking lot where the last light of day was fading into purple twilight. The cool evening air hit her face like a slap, and she stood there gasping, her hands shaking, her heart racing so fast she thought she might pass out. Behind her, through the shop windows, she could see the mirror standing in its place, the white cloth pooled at its base where she'd dropped it. And for just a moment, before she turned and ran for her car, she could have sworn she saw movement in the glass. A figure, standing perfectly still, watching her leave. Rayna drove home with her hands clenched on the steering wheel, her mind working overtime to rationalise what she'd seen. It was the lighting. It was exhaustion. It was the power of suggestion after Mr. Holloway's warnings. It was anything, everything, except what her instincts were screaming at her. That something in the mirror had been real, that something had been watching her, that something had smiled. By the time she pulled into her apartment complex, she'd almost convinced herself it had all been in her head. She would get a good night's sleep, and in the morning, this would all seem like a ridiculous overreaction to shadows and an old man's ghost stories. She would not think about the way her reflection had moved on its own. She would not think about the furniture in the wrong positions. She would not think about the hungry look in those eyes that had been hers but somehow weren't. Rayna climbed the stairs to her second-floor apartment, unlocked her door, and stepped inside. She dropped her bag by the entrance, kicked off her shoes, and walked straight to the bathroom to splash cold water on her face. She flipped on the light and immediately froze. The bathroom mirror hung above the sink, just as it always had. And in it, Rayna saw herself, pale and shaken, her dark hair dishevelled, her eyes wide with lingering fear. But for just a fraction of a second, so brief she might have imagined it, she could have sworn her reflection had been smiling before her own face came into view. Rayna backed out of the bathroom and closed the door. She told herself she was being paranoid. She told herself she needed sleep. She told herself that tomorrow, in the clear light of day, all of this would make sense. But deep down, in a place beyond rational thought, beyond academic training and psychological expertise, Rayna knew the truth. Something had followed her home. But the reflection wasn't done with her. It had been waiting decades for someone to look, and now it had found a way out. Rayna woke up the next morning standing in front of her bathroom mirror. She had no memory of getting out of bed, no memory of walking across her bedroom and down the hall, no memory of opening the bathroom door and turning on the light. But there she was, barefoot on the cold tile floor, staring at her own reflection in the harsh fluorescent glow. The clock on her phone said it was 3:17 in the morning. She'd been standing there for 20 minutes. Rayna stumbled backward, her heart racing, and fled to her bedroom. She told herself it was sleepwalking, nothing more, stress-induced parasomnia. She'd read about cases like this in graduate school. The mind did strange things under pressure, and she'd been under a lot of pressure lately. But when she climbed back into bed and closed her eyes, she could still feel the pull of the mirror, like a hook lodged somewhere behind her sternum, tugging her back toward the glass. The next day started wrong and got worse. Rayna taught an introductory psychology course at 9 on Tuesday mornings, and she'd never missed a class in 6 years of teaching. But when her alarm went off at 7, her hand reached out and shut it off before her conscious mind had even registered the sound. She lay there in bed, meaning to get up, planning to get up, but her body simply wouldn't move. It was the strangest sensation. She could feel everything. The sheets against her skin, the morning light creeping through her curtains, the urgent need to get ready for class. But it was like there was a disconnect between her intentions and her actions, a lag in the signal between her brain and her muscles. When she finally did move, it felt wrong, delayed, like she was puppeting her own body from a distance. She made it to campus 40 minutes late, her hair uncombed, still wearing the clothes she'd slept in. Her students stared at her with concern as she stumbled through a lecture on cognitive dissonance, losing her train of thought mid-sentence, forgetting words she'd used 1,000 times before. Afterward, her teaching assistant asked if she was feeling all right. She looked tired, he said. She looked different somehow. Rayna tried to reassure him that she was fine, just a bit under the weather. But the words came out flat and cold, like someone reading lines from a script they didn't understand. Her teaching assistant took a step back, something flickering in his eyes that looked almost like fear, and told her maybe she should go home and rest. She drove home in a daze, and that's when she noticed it. Her hands on the steering wheel were moving slightly out of sync with her intentions. She'd think about turning left, and a fraction of a second later, her hands would move. she'd think about braking, and her foot would press the pedal a heartbeat too late. It was subtle, barely noticeable, but it was there. And then she caught herself smiling in the rearview mirror, except she wasn't happy. She wasn't feeling anything remotely close to happiness. But her face in the mirror wore a wide, satisfied smile, and it took her a full 3 seconds to force her expression back to neutral. 3 seconds where her face simply wouldn't obey her. Rayna pulled into a gas station and sat in her car with her hands shaking. This wasn't stress. This wasn't exhaustion. This was something else. Something wrong. Something that had started the moment she'd looked into that mirror in Mr. Holloway's shop. She pulled out her phone to call her doctor, but found herself opening the camera app instead. She watched her own face on the screen, watched herself watching herself, and couldn't remember why she'd taken out her phone in the first place. The next 3 days blurred together in a nightmare of lost time and stolen control. Rayna missed 2 more classes. She'd set her alarm, lay in bed fully intending to get up, and then suddenly it would be noon, and she'd be standing in front of her bathroom mirror again with no memory of the hours in between. Her boyfriend Marcus came over on Wednesday evening and found her sitting on a couch in the dark, staring at the blank television screen. He'd been calling her all day, he said, worry thick in his voice. Why hadn't she answered? Was something wrong? Rayna tried to tell him she was fine, that she'd just been busy, but her voice came out wrong. Flatter, colder, like the warmth had been leached out of her vocal cords. Marcus sat down beside her and took her hand, and she felt his touch like it was happening to someone else, like she was experiencing her own life through a thick pane of glass. He told her she'd been acting strange lately, distant. He asked if something had happened, if there was anything she wanted to talk about. Rayna opened her mouth to tell him everything, about the antique shop, about the mirror, about the way her reflection had moved on its own. But what came out instead was a bland reassurance that she was just tired from work. Her voice was so flat, so devoid of emotion, that Marcus actually flinched. He stayed for another hour, trying to engage her in conversation. But Rayna could barely focus on his words. She kept catching glimpses of herself in the dark television screen, in the window behind Marcus's head, in the face of her silent phone. Every reflective surface in her apartment had become a trap, and she couldn't stop looking. Marcus finally left around 9, telling her to call him if she needed anything. His face creased with concern. Rayna nodded and smiled, and only after the door closed did she realise her smile had lingered too long, had stayed frozen on her face for a full 10 seconds after he'd gone. That night she covered every mirror in her apartment with towels and bed sheets. She turned her phone face down. She closed all the curtains to block out the windows. She sat in the middle of her living room floor with all the lights on and tried to feel like herself again. But the pull was still there, that hook behind her sternum, tugging her toward the glass, toward her own reflection, toward something that wanted to be her more than she wanted to be herself. On Thursday, Rayna woke up, if waking was even the right word, standing in her kit potter at 2 a.m. She'd removed the sheet from the microwave door and was staring at her dim reflection in the glass, her face slack and empty, her eyes unfocused. And for just a moment, before her conscious mind caught up with her body, she felt herself smile, not her face, herself. The thing inside her that was slowly taking over. It was pleased with its progress. By Friday, Rayna had to face the truth. She was losing control of her own body. She'd be walking down the hall and her feet would stop without her permission. She'd be reaching for a glass of water and her hand would change direction, mid-movement. She'd be speaking and her voice would flatten mid-sentence. All the emotion draining out of it like someone had flipped a switch. Worst of all were the moments when her reflection moved first. She'd catch sight of herself in a window and watch her reflection turn its head a split second before her actual head turned. She'd see her reflection in a puddle, reach up to brush hair from its face, and then her own hand would follow, mimicking the movement like a puppet on strings. She was becoming a passenger in her own flesh. Friday afternoon, Rayna locked herself in her bedroom and tried to call Mr. Holloway. Her hands shook as she dialed the number for the antique shop, her heart hammering with desperate hope that he would answer, that he would know how to stop this. The phone rang once, then her hand, her own hand, the one holding the phone, moved without her permission and ended the call. Rayna stared at her fingers in horror. She tried again, managing to dial the number and hit call before her hand betrayed her once more, hanging up before the first ring finished. She tried a third time, and this time her entire arm went limp, the phone clattering to the floor. She wasn't in control anymore. Something else was driving her body, and it didn't want her calling for help. Rayna collapsed on her bedroom floor and tried to scream, but her voice came out as barely a whisper. She tried to cry, but her tear ducts wouldn't cooperate. She tried to feel anything: fear, rage, desperation. But her emotions were muffled, distant, like they belonged to someone else. She was being erased from the inside out. That night, Rayna stood in front of her covered bathroom mirror for 3 hours. She didn't want to be there. She tried to leave, tried to force her legs to move, but her body simply wouldn't obey. She could only stand there, motionless, while the thing inside her studied the covered glass like a predator studying a caged door. Around midnight, her hand reached up, slowly, deliberately, and pulled the towel away from the mirror. Rayna saw herself in the glass, but it wasn't her anymore. The eyes were too focused. The posture was too perfect. The smile was too wide and too satisfied. Her reflection tilted its head, and Rayna's head tilted a heartbeat later, following the command. Her reflection raised its hand and pressed its palm against the glass from the inside, and Rayna's hand raised and pressed against the glass from the outside. For one terrible moment, Rayna could feel it. The thing on the other side of the mirror. The thing that had been studying her, learning her, becoming her. It was almost complete now. Almost ready. And when it was done, there would be nothing of Rayna left at all. For Rayna, the bigger problem wasn't losing control. It was what the reflection wanted to do, once it had her body completely. Rayna discovered the pattern by accident. Saturday morning, she woke up in her bathtub, fully clothed, her body curled in the fetal position. She had no memory of getting there, no sense of how long she'd been lying on the cold porcelain. The bathroom was pitch black. She'd covered the mirror so thoroughly with sheets and towels that no light penetrated the makeshift shroud. But as she lay there in the darkness, disoriented and confused, she realised something crucial. She could think clearly. For the first time in days, her thoughts felt like her own. The fog that had been smothering her mind, that thick, cottony sensation that had made thinking feel like wading through mud, had lifted. The terrible pull toward reflective surfaces had weakened to a dull ache instead of an irresistible compulsion. She was in a room with no reflections, and somehow that mattered. That made all the difference. Rayna lay still for several minutes, testing this newfound clarity. She thought about standing up, and her body obeyed without the usual delay. She flexed her fingers, and they moved in perfect synchronization with her intentions. The disconnect between mind and body, that horrible, puppet-like sensation, had faded to almost nothing. She was in a room with no reflections, and she was herself again. Almost. Rayna spent the next hour crawling through her apartment on her hands and knees, keeping her eyes fixed on the floor, avoiding every window and screen and polished surface. She moved like a soldier crossing a minefield, hyper-aware of every reflective threat. The television screen, the microwave door, the darkened windows, her phone lying face up on the coffee table. Each one was a trap waiting to spring. She made it to her bedroom closet and pulled the door shut behind her, sealing herself in complete darkness. And there, surrounded by hanging clothes and shoeboxes, and the familiar smell of her own belongings, she felt almost human again. Almost herself. She could still feel it inside her, the thing that had been slowly devouring her identity. But in the absence of reflections, it seemed dormant, sleeping, like a parasite that needed to see its own stolen face to maintain its grip on her consciousness, to keep its hooks embedded in her mind. Rayna pulled out her phone, her hands trembling as she adjusted the screen brightness to its lowest setting. The glow was barely visible, just enough to see the icons. She kept the phone face down so she couldn't see her reflection in the black screen when it dimmed, navigating by memory and touch alone. It took her 20 minutes of careful searching to find a listing for Holloway's Antiquities. The shop had no website, barely any online presence at all, just a few mentions in old business directories, and a single outdated Yelp page with no reviews. But she finally located a phone number buried in a decade-old business registry, and she dialed before her body could betray her again. The phone rang 6 times. Rayna held her breath, praying he would answer, praying she could get the words out before the thing inside her woke up and reasserted control. She could feel it stirring at the edges of her consciousness, disturbed by her movement, by her planning, by her desperate attempt to fight back. On the 7th ring, someone picked up. Mr. Holloway's voice came through the line thin and wary, asking who was calling at such an early hour on a Saturday morning. Rayna could hear the fear in his tone, the exhaustion of someone who'd been waiting for a call like this for a very long time, someone who'd been dreading it. She told him it was Rayna Potter, the woman who'd visited his shop on Monday evening. Her voice cracked as she spoke, desperation bleeding through every word. She told him she'd looked into the mirror after dark, that she'd uncovered it despite his warnings. She told him something was wrong with her, that she was losing control of her own body, that she was forgetting things, important things, pieces of herself. She told him she needed his help desperately. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Rayna could hear Mr. Holloway breathing, could hear what sounded like a stifled sob, or maybe a bitter laugh. Then he spoke, and his voice was heavy with guilt and resignation. He told her he'd tried to warn her. He'd tried so hard to make her understand, but she hadn't listened. Nobody ever listened until it was too late. Rayna's throat tightened with tears she couldn't quite shed. She told him she knew, that she was sorry, that she'd been stupid and arrogant, and dismissive of his warnings. She thought she was too rational, too educated, too grounded in reality to fall victim to superstition. But she'd been wrong, and now she was paying for it. She told him she didn't care about being right anymore. She just needed to know what was happening to her. She needed to know how to stop it before it was too late, before she was gone, completely. Mr. Holloway's voice dropped to barely a whisper. He asked her where she was right now, at this exact moment. Was she looking at any reflective surfaces? Could she see her own face anywhere? Rayna told him she was in her closet, in complete darkness, that it was the only place she could think clearly anymore, the only place the thing inside her seemed to sleep. She told him that when she avoided reflections, she could almost feel like herself again. "Good," Mr. Holloway said, and there was relief in his voice. "Stay there. Don't look at anything reflective. Not even for a second. Not your phone screen, not a window, not even a puddle of water on the floor. Because the moment she did, the thing inside her would wake up fully, and she might not get another chance to fight back or regain control. These moments of clarity were precious and fleeting." Then he began to tell her the truth about what was happening to her, and Rayna listened with growing horror. The thing in the mirror wasn't a ghost, he explained. It wasn't a spirit or a demon or any of the supernatural entities that populated folklore and horror stories. It was something older and stranger and infinitely more patient than any of those things. A parasite that existed in the space between reflection and reality. In that thin membrane where light bounces off glass and creates the illusion of a second world. Most people never thought about reflections, Mr. Holloway continued. They took them for granted, accepted them as simple physics, light and angles, and nothing more. But what if reflections were more than that? What if the mirror world was real in its own way, a shadow dimension that ran parallel to ours, separated by nothing more than a pane of glass? Most of the time, Mr. Holloway explained, the barrier between that world and ours was too strong to cross. Reflections remained just reflections, harmless copies of reality, with no consciousness or will of their own. But after dark, when shadows deepened and the distinction between real and reflected grew blurry, when the light changed and the world took on that strange twilight quality, the barrier thinned. And if someone looked into the right mirror at the right time, or the wrong mirror at the wrong time, the parasite could make eye contact, could establish a connection, could begin the long, slow process of crossing over from its world into ours. Rayna's voice shook as she asked what it wanted. Why was it doing this to her? What had she done to deserve this nightmare? She was just a psychology professor who collected antiques. She hadn't hurt anyone. She didn't deserve this. Mr. Holloway's answer made her blood run cold. It didn't just want to possess her, he said carefully, choosing his words with precision. Possession implied cohabitation, a sharing of space, two consciousnesses existing in one body, fighting for control. What the parasite wanted was far worse than that. It wanted to replace her entirely. To walk in her skin, live her life, consume her identity so completely that nothing of Rayna Potter would remain. Not her memories, not her personality, not her hopes or dreams or fears, not even the smallest fragment of her consciousness or soul. It would become her, perfectly, completely. It would wear her life like a costume, and no one would ever know the difference. Rayna felt her stomach lurch with nausea. She asked him how that was possible, how something could just erase a person and take their place without anyone noticing. Surely someone would realise. Her boyfriend, her colleagues, her students. Surely someone would see that she wasn't herself anymore. But Mr. Holloway told her no. Nobody would notice. That was the terrible genius of the parasite. It didn't just steal her body, it stole everything that made her who she was. He explained that the parasite fed on identity itself, on the very essence of what made a person unique. Every time Rayna looked at her reflection, every time she saw her own face in glass or water or a phone screen, the parasite learned more about her. It studied her expressions, her mannerisms, her speech patterns, the way she moved and smiled and frowned. It absorbed her memories by rifling through her mind, like someone going through a filing cabinet, pulling out pieces of her history and making them its own. It learned her relationships, her habits, her preferences, her fears. And as it learned, Rayna forgot. The realization hit her like a physical blow to the chest. She'd been noticing gaps in her memory for days now. Small things at first, like forgetting why she'd picked up her phone or what she'd planned to do that morning. Forgetting where she'd put her keys or whether she'd eaten breakfast. But it had been getting worse with each passing day, the gaps growing larger and more frequent. Yesterday she'd forgotten her teaching assistant's name, a young man named David who she'd worked with for 2 years. She'd stared at him blankly when he'd spoken to her, unable to recall his name or even why he looked familiar. This morning she'd stared at her coffee maker for 5 full minutes, unable to remember how to operate the simple machine. She'd stood there with an empty mug in her hand, staring at the buttons like they were written in a foreign language. And her mother's voice. She tried to remember it now, tried to recall the sound of her mother calling her name when she was a child, the warmth and love in that voice. But she found only silence where the memory should have been. The voice was gone, erased, as if it had never existed, as if her mother had never existed. Rayna started to cry, real tears this time, her body finally obeying her enough to express the horror and grief she felt. She asked Mr. Holloway how much time she had left before she was gone completely, before there was nothing left of her to save. His answer was brutally honest, delivered in a voice heavy with sympathy and regret. Based on Siba, how far gone she already was, the extensive memory loss, the loss of motor control, the long periods of missing time where the parasite had been driving her body like a stolen car. He estimated she had less than 24 hours before the transformation was complete. Maybe even less than that, depending on how strong the parasite was, how many times she'd looked at her reflection since the initial contact. Once the parasite had consumed enough of her identity, absorbed enough of her memories and mannerisms, it would complete the crossing. Her body would continue to walk and talk and live, would go to work and have conversations and make decisions. But Rayna Potter would be gone, erased, as if she'd never existed at all. Rayna pressed her hand over her mouth to stifle a sob that threatened to turn into a scream. She couldn't scream, couldn't draw attention, couldn't let anyone see her like this. She asked if there was any way to stop it, any way to fight back and reclaim herself before it was too late. Mr. Holloway was quiet for a long moment, and Rayna could hear him breathing heavily on the other end of the line. She could hear the weight of decades in that breathing, the exhaustion of a man who'd been running from something for far too long. Then he told her there was one way, only one. She had to destroy the original mirror, the one in his shop, the Victorian mirror with the ornate gold frame and the roses carved into the edges. That was the parasite's anchor point, the place where it lived when it wasn't actively feeding on someone. If she could destroy that mirror before the transformation completed, the connection would sever. The parasite would be pulled back into the shattered glass, ripped away from her, and Rayna would be free. Hope flared in Rayna's chest, bright and desperate, and painful. She told him she would do it. She would drive to his shop right now, this very moment, and smash the mirror into 1,000 pieces. She would grind the glass into dust if she had to, whatever it took. But Mr. Holloway's next words doused that hope like cold water poured over flames. He told her it wouldn't be that easy. Nothing about this was easy. The parasite knew what she was planning the moment she thought it. It had access to her mind now, to her thoughts and intentions and plans. It would fight her every step of the way. It would use her own body against her, would seize control at the worst possible moments, would do everything in its considerable power to stop her from reaching the mirror and destroying its anchor. And even if she made it to the shop, even if she managed to break in and find something heavy enough to shatter the glass, she'd have to do it without looking at the mirror directly. Because the moment her eyes met the glass, the moment she saw her reflection in that Victorian mirror, the parasite would have her completely. There would be no coming back from that, no second chances, no last-minute salvation. Rayna felt the weight of impossibility settling over her like a heavy blanket. She asked Mr. Holloway how he'd escaped. He'd mentioned making the same mistake 40 years ago, looking into the mirror after dark. How had he survived when it seemed so impossible, when the odds were so stacked against her? The old man's voice turned hollow, haunted by decades of fear and isolation. He told her he hadn't really escaped. Not fully. Not in any meaningful way. He'd managed to avoid looking at the mirror long enough that the parasite's grip weakened, but it never fully released him. For 40 years, he'd lived in constant vigilance, avoiding his own reflection like it was poison. He'd covered every mirror in his shop and his home. He hadn't seen his own face in 4 decades, hadn't looked at a photograph of himself, hadn't caught his reflection in a window or a puddle or a piece of polished metal. Because the parasite was still there, still waiting in the glass. And if he ever looked, if he ever made that eye contact again, it would finish what it started all those years ago. It never forgot, never gave up, never stopped waiting. That was the real horror, he said quietly. The parasite was patient in a way that humans could never understand. It could wait forever if it had to. It had been waiting in that Victorian mirror for over a century, and it would wait another century if necessary. Time meant nothing to it. It had all the time in the world. Rayna's hands were shaking so badly she almost dropped the phone. She asked him to help her, to come with her to the shop, to guide her through the process, to make sure she destroyed the mirror properly. She couldn't do this alone. She was too scared, too weak, too close to losing herself completely. But Mr. Holloway told her he couldn't do that. If he went near that mirror, if he even entered the same room with it after all these years, the parasite would sense him immediately, would recognize him as the one who got away. And it would take them both, would split its attention between 2 victims, and they would both be lost. He couldn't risk it. He'd spent 40 years staying away from that mirror, and he couldn't break that streak now. Rayna was on her own. She had less than 24 hours to drive to the shop, break into the building, find the mirror in the dark, and destroy it without looking at her own reflection, all while fighting against her own body, her own mind, her own traitorous hands that no longer fully obeyed her commands. It seemed impossible. It probably was impossible. Mr. Holloway told her one last thing before he hung up. He told her to be strong, to fight with everything she had, to remember who she was, even as the parasite tried to make her forget, to hold on to her identity with both hands and never let go, to repeat her name, her history, her memories like a mantra, to anchor herself in who she was. Because once she was gone, there would be no getting her back. The line went dead. And Rayna sat in the darkness of her closet, her phone clutched in her trembling hands, and tried to hold on to herself. She repeated her name over and over like a mantra, like a prayer, like a spell that might keep her from disappearing. Rayna Potter, Rayna Potter, psychology professor at the university, daughter of Michael and Linda Potter, girlfriend of Marcus, collector of antiques, Rayna Potter. But already the details were slipping away, like water through her fingers. What did her father look like? She tried to picture his face and found only a blur. What was her favourite food? She couldn't remember. Where had she grown up? The answer was there somewhere, buried in the fog. But she couldn't quite reach it. The gaps were spreading, consuming her memories one by one, erasing her piece by piece. And she had less than a day to save herself. But what Mr. Holloway didn't tell her was the price of destroying the mirror, and what would happen to everyone the parasite had ever touched. Rayna left her apartment at 9:30 that night, moving through the darkness like a sleepwalker. She'd spent the last few hours in her closet, repeating her name until it lost all meaning, clinging to memories that kept slipping away like smoke through her fingers. She'd waited until full dark when the streets would be emptier, when there would be fewer reflective surfaces to navigate, fewer traps waiting to ensnare her. But the moment she stepped outside, she knew it was going to be nearly impossible. The city at night was a minefield of reflections. Storefront windows lined the streets like mirrors, each one catching fragments of her image as she passed. Car windows distorted her face in twisted angles. Even puddles from an earlier rain captured her silhouette in their dark surfaces. The world was made of glass and water and polished metal, all of it conspiring to show her own face back to her. Rayna kept her eyes fixed on the ground, on the pavement directly in front of her feet, and walked as quickly as she dared. She could feel the pull of every reflective surface she passed, that terrible magnetic draw wanting her to look, to see herself, to make eye contact with the thing that was wearing her face from the inside. Her car was parked 2 blocks away. It might as well have been 2 miles. Halfway there, her legs stopped moving. Rayna's body froze mid-step, 1 foot raised, balanced precariously on the sidewalk. She tried to command her muscles to move, to continue walking, but nothing happened. She was a statue, trapped in her own flesh. Then her head began to turn, slowly, inexorably, toward a darkened storefront window. No, Rayna screamed inside her own mind. No, 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 but her neck kept turning, muscles moving against her will, and she caught a glimpse of her reflection in the glass. Just a glimpse, barely a second, but it was enough. The thing inside her surged forward with renewed strength, and Rayna felt herself being pushed back, deeper into the recesses of her own consciousness. When her body started moving again, the movements were smoother, more confident, less like Rayna and more like something else entirely. She made it to her car and climbed inside. For a terrifying moment, her hands refused to put the key in the ignition. They hovered there, trembling, while 2 different wills fought for control of the same flesh. Rayna pushed with everything she had, every ounce of determination and desperation she could muster, and finally her hand moved. The key slid into the ignition, and the engine roared to life. The drive to Holloway's Antiquities took 20 minutes that felt like 20 hours. Rayna drove with her eyes fixed firmly on the road, refusing to look at the rearview mirror, refusing to glance at her reflection in the driver's side window. Every stoplight was an agony of waiting, of fighting the urge to look. The parasite was stronger now. She could feel it wearing her face from the inside, stretching into her skin like someone trying on clothes. It knew her thoughts before she fully formed them. It anticipated her movements, her reactions, her desperate plans. It knew she was going to the shop to destroy the mirror, and it wasn't worried. Rayna pulled up in front of Holloway's Antiquities at 10:15. The shop was dark, closed for the night, a heavy padlock securing the front door. The Victorian mirror waited somewhere inside, in the darkness, patient and hungry. She grabbed a tire iron from her trunk and approached the door. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely grip the metal. She raised the tire iron and brought it down on the padlock with all her strength. The lock held. She struck it again, and again, and again. On the 5th strike, the lock broke with a satisfying crack, and the door swung open. Rayna stepped inside and the darkness swallowed her whole. The shop was different at night. The antiques that had seemed charming and nostalgic in daylight now looked sinister, their shadows stretching across the floor like grasping fingers. Rayna pulled out her phone for light, keeping the screen pointed away from her face, and made her way toward the back of the shop, where she'd first seen the Victorian mirror. The mirror was still there, exactly where she remembered it. The ornate gold frame gleamed in the phone's dim light, and the glass surface seemed to shimmer with an oily, iridescent quality. Rayna kept her eyes averted, looking at the frame, at the floor, at anything but the reflective surface itself. She set down her phone, face down on a nearby table, and picked up a heavy wooden chair. She raised it above her head, her muscles straining with the weight, and prepared to bring it down on the mirror with every ounce of strength she possessed. But before she could strike, her reflection spoke. The voice came from the mirror, and it was her voice, exactly her voice. The same tone, the same inflection, the same slight rasp she got when she was tired. It told her to stop, to put down the chair, to listen. Rayna's arms trembled with effort, the chair still raised above her head. She kept her eyes fixed on the frame, refusing to look at the glass, refusing to see what was speaking to her in her own voice. But the reflection continued talking, and with each word, Rayna felt her resolve weakening. It told her there was no point in destroying the mirror. The mirror was just a doorway, it explained, nothing more. A threshold between worlds. Destroying the doorway wouldn't change what had already crossed over. The parasite had already made the journey. It had been living inside her skull for 3 days now, learning her, copying her, becoming her. And now the transformation was complete. Rayna's arms began to lower despite her best efforts. The chair descended slowly, her muscles betraying her, and she wanted to scream but couldn't make a sound. The reflection told her it knew everything about her now. It knew how she took her coffee, black with 1 sugar. It knew her favourite childhood memory, building sandcastles with her father at Ocean Beach when she was 7. It knew the scar on her left knee from falling off her bike when she was 10. It knew the way she always tapped her pen 3 times before starting to grade papers. It knew her better than she knew herself. Rayna finally looked at the mirror, unable to resist any longer, and saw herself staring back. But it wasn't her. Not really. The reflection wore her face perfectly, mimicked her expressions flawlessly. But there was something in the eyes, something ancient and patient and utterly inhuman. The reflection smiled, and it was Rayna's smile. The same slight asymmetry, the same way her left cheek dimpled more than her right, perfect in every detail. It told her the truth she'd been trying not to accept. There was no destroying it because it wasn't in the mirror anymore. It was in her. It had been in her since the moment she'd made eye contact that first night. The mirror was just where it had waited, where it had lived for over a century, but it didn't need the mirror anymore. It had her. Rayna tried to speak, tried to argue, tried to beg, but her voice wouldn't work. Her throat had closed, her vocal cords frozen, and she could only stand there and listen as the thing wearing her face explained what was going to happen next. The parasite had been patient, it said. It had taken its time, learning every detail, absorbing every memory, perfecting every mannerism. It didn't just want to possess her body, it wanted to be indistinguishable from her. It wanted to fool everyone who knew her, everyone who loved her, everyone who would never suspect that Rayna Potter had been replaced by something else entirely. And it had succeeded. Rayna felt something fundamental shift inside her consciousness. It was like standing on a beach and feeling the sand wash out from under her feet. That terrible sensation of the ground disappearing. She was being pulled backward, away from her own body, away from control, away from everything that made her real. Her arms lowered the chair completely, setting it down gently on the floor. Her hands she'd had her entire life, no longer obeyed her. Her legs, her arms, her face, her voice. All of it was responding to someone else now. The parasite had won. Rayna tried to scream, but her mouth wouldn't open. She tried to move, but her body stood perfectly still. She was trapped inside her own skull, a prisoner in her own flesh, able to see and hear and feel everything, but unable to control anything. She watched in horror as her body turned away from the mirror and walked calmly toward the shop's entrance. Her movements were fluid and natural, no trace of the jerky, puppet-like quality from before. The parasite had fully integrated itself into her nervous system, had learned to operate her body with perfect precision. It was her now, and she was nothing. But then Rayna noticed something even more terrifying. As her body walked past the mirror, she caught a glimpse of her reflection, and it wasn't moving. Her reflection stood frozen in the glass, hands pressed against the surface from the inside, mouth open in a silent scream. That was her, the real her, trapped in the mirror while the parasite walked away in her stolen body. The roles had reversed completely. The parasite had crossed over, and Rayna had been pushed back into the mirror world, into that shadow dimension where reflections lived. She was the reflection now, trapped behind the glass, watching helplessly as something else wore her life like a costume. Her body, the parasite, paused at the shop's entrance and looked back. It smiled, perfect and practiced. Then it spoke in Rayna's voice, warm and utterly convincing. It would take good care of her life. Go to work, have dinner with Marcus, call her parents. Live her life so perfectly that no one would ever know the difference. And then it would spread. That was the real horror. It didn't just want one body, it wanted everyone Rayna knew. Everyone who would look into a mirror after dark and make eye contact with the thing wearing her face. The parasite texted Marcus, "Coming home, can't wait to see you." It adjusted her jacket, practiced her laugh, ran fingers through her hair. Then it walked out, leaving Rayna trapped in the mirror, and disappeared into the night. Rayna screamed inside the glass, but no sound came out. She watched her body drive away, headed home to Marcus, to her life, to everyone she loved. Hours passed. The mirror world was cold, empty, timeless. She sensed other trapped souls, distant and faded. Rayna would become like them eventually. Morning came. Mr. Holloway entered the shop and saw the shattered mirror. In every fragment, Rayna's face stared back. 1,000 reflections, all screaming silently, all trapped forever. He fell to his knees, tears streaming. "I'm sorry," he whispered. But it was too late. The parasite had won. Across town, the thing that looked exactly like Rayna Potter woke up next to Marcus, smiled with her smile, and said good morning in her voice. Nobody suspected a thing.